Again, this is a direct continuation, and I am relying on the first half an hour of episode 19 and all of episodes 21, and I guess 22 and 3. No, sorry, 23 and 4 at this point. And so what we're really considering is like how can the Jungian insights help us? So we have this, this kind of very brief summary that metacrisis, meaning crisis are two sides of the same coin, and they can be reasonably viewed as a kind of split condition either between self and world or humanity and nature or the fallen condition as per Christianity, that all these are different ways to talk about the same condition, the same split condition, and that there is this prescription not only for ecologies of practices among communities of practitioners in a kind of monastery model to do the wisdom school bit to kind of solve the meaning crisis by through connecting more deeply to the world, right? That's great. But that we can actually um, involve the creativity of the unconscious to solve real problems in the world. The idea is that to try to model a new form of social organization and self-organizing group process to facilitate the solution of real-world problems. That's the gist. So the question then comes there, like in that context of an intention, group practice and intentional practice in groups as a kind of prescription. Okay, well, once we have that context set up as this sphere of response to the situation, how can Jungian insights help us? Jung talks a great deal about the reconciliation between different pairs of opposites. And I've been working with this quote: one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And so, yes, it is abstract because I'm an abstract person, but it's grounded in, you know, the ecology of practices and real world contribution in action to real problems in the world and new forms of social, not just psychological organization. So what I'm moving into here is the insights from the third hour of episode 4, again following on from the last two. And so we've been talking about facilitating unconscious process. We've been talking about allowing for the emergence of symbols, symbols that express our sort of 4E embedded, extended, embodied, enacted involvement in the world that can bring the depth of our unconscious into our awareness in a way which can bind us more deeply to the world and resolve tension between polarities that can be observed but not solved from the level of the ego. So I've talked already about why symbols are important because they have this unique capacity to mediate between opposites in this way. And the general prescription of going back down to our inner depths and facilitating the process of unconscious emergence as a way to do that. We were talking a lot about the right attitude, the right orientation in that context, and I really think about this from a phenomenological point of view, right? I'm really like I'm experiencing in the world what Jung means by the transcendent function, right? It's because, hey, there's a conflict out in the world, there's a real polarity, a binary conflict that I cannot get past. And in the recognition of my insufficiency to do that, I can have the humility and indeed the letting go orientation, the surrendering process of returning to a kind of inner spaciousness and inner receptivity that allows a childlikeness, a spontaneity, a quality of serious play to emerge. This could be facilitated in groups, is the idea, that can allow for the emergence of these creative products, be they insights or symbols, forms of expression, and that these symbols, they in some way constellate a different center of awareness, which is quite something to wrap one's mind around. I mean, Viveki has talked about this extensively. It's like this is the we sense, the Geist, you know, that through dialogos we can give rise to an emergent sense that there is something among and between us that is more than the sum of the parts. And for Jung, this our creative expressions can kind of constellate the awareness of what he calls the self. Okay, so now I'm going to return to that was sort of, I guess, all bridging. And so when I think about this phenomenologically, when I try to take this on as a perspective, well, there's an awareness that I have of this conflict, this polarity out in the world, some obstacle that I cannot get past. It's the idea that any problem could be conceived of as a binary conflict in some way. And I'll maybe talk in a different place about why and how to conceive of it in that way. The idea is that once we're aware of a binary conflict, can we then orient our will, our freedom, our agency toward the unconscious, toward our own creative depths? Okay, so when we do that, Jung talks about Schiller, and this is again taken from chapter 2 in Psychological Types, ultimately, where when we do that, when we orient our will back toward the unconscious in that way to facilitate this emergent process, it kind of seems as if the opposites cancel themselves out. In Dialogos, for example, this comes up as the sense that there is no one, that the ego sort of drops away in a certain way. There's a kind of canceling or avoiding of the ego. Now, Jung is going to give an idea here which is a little tricky. And so Jung talks about how the activity of this binary conflict, this pair of opposites, however conceived, it doesn't disappear entirely, but it's simply active within the unconscious. And so what we get here is a shift in the awareness, at least from my point of view. This is that we get the conscious sense that our consciousness, our field of awareness, is one half of a certain binary, and that the unconscious is at least, if not more, extensive as our consciousness. And this idea is that there is not only a conscious polarity or binary that we can see or experience out in the world, but there is actually a opposite or inverted version of that polarity within the unconscious. And that's quite tricky to wrap one's head around, I think. I'm going to talk more about what I mean by that, but here, simply the idea is that when we take our will away from this conflict between opposites and point it toward the unconscious, so to say, it's not that the binary conflict completely disappears or goes away, but that the activity of that polarity of that binary is occurring within the unconscious. So it's kind of mirrored or inverted on the other side of a screen of glass, if you like. So the activity of the binary split within the unconscious is the opposite of the conscious dynamic between the opposites. One way to imagistically conceptualize this is that there's a binary on the top, let's say, a two, a two-ness, is conceived of as a conflict, but there's an equivalent conflict beneath. And so that changes the orientation here because the idea is now that the center of consciousness that we approach as what Jung calls the self is not simply down in the depths all the way down. It's actually between, it's actually in the middle. It's actually a convergence point between both conscious and unconscious. Okay. And so the trick here is that in order to facilitate the emergence of the creative process that we're talking about, the emergence of the self, we don't want to just allow anything to come through from the unconscious because this could be quite scary, harmful, dramatic, decidedly not helpful. The idea is that we're actually looking for something specific. We're looking for these symbols, or it's even looking for them isn't quite the right phrase. We're hoping to facilitate a certain kind of emergence from the unconscious, not just any kind of emergence. And we talked about like last time, in order to facilitate that process, that the conflict has to be sort of withdrawn from the polarity. So we have to sort of take our awareness and be conscious that we're being torn apart by this pair of opposites. But then from out of an inner spaciousness, return to the unconscious, return to our inner depths, and facilitate a creative emergence that is designed to solve the conflict. The trick here is that withdrawal that I was talking about from the conscious pair of opposites is also designed or intended to be a withdrawal from the unconscious pair of opposites as well. And that's tricky. And so I think this is why we see here that perspective taking as a skill is really helpful because it actually then becomes necessary skill. It's a necessary skill. It's a necessary skill for the facilitation of the emergence of the self, what Jung calls the self. The idea would be that if we can't find a perspective within ourselves to be aware of an unconscious conflict just as much as a conscious conflict, then we're simply going to express that unconscious conflict when we allow for creativity to emerge. The idea is that without this spaciousness that goes along with the perspective of the soul, uncontaminated by the conscious and unconscious polarities, without that spaciousness, then the production of the creative symbols that derive from the self will be contaminated. It won't be able to fulfill itself, or it will be distorted. And so this is why I talked about, and indeed Jung talked about, these qualities that go along with the perspective of the soul that have to do with childlikeness and spontaneity and a kind of freedom of involvement, is because those qualities of serious play, it's only that quality of our disposition, it's only that way of being that can allow the kind of expression that we're seeking. And without that sensitivity, we simply express the conflict that we're aware of in its unconscious form. And that isn't helpful. And so this is why Jung is correct to say, I would say, that working with the unconscious is necessary. We have to work with the unconscious in order to differentiate ourselves from the unconscious polarity. We have to have a facility with working with the unconscious enough that we can disidentify not only from the conscious version of the polarity, but also the unconscious, opposite, inverted version. And I would say that the ecology of practices is designed to facilitate that. There's a further idea here that if we only focus on the what I've called the mirror glass, it's like the between space, the line between conscious and unconscious. If we only do that, then we haven't really withdrawn from this unconscious version of the conflict between opposites. And that's going to produce results which are, like I said, dramatic, scary. Um, we're going to simply express that conflict in its unconscious form rather than express the solution in the form of the symbols derived from the self. So this is what Jung meant by that Latin phrase, in sterculinis invenitur, in filth it will be found, which he'd written above his doorway, is that it's necessary to work with the unconscious to the extent that we can find the jewel in the mud. We can allow for what might be called genuine self-expression. And I think this is how we can, this is why a story about liberating the soul can help us as a guideline, I think, because it's about releasing the soul from the inhibiting constraints of unconscious influence. If we're not able to work with the unconscious and with the archetypes which govern it enough to liberate the soul, then we're not able to be in the perspective of childlike wonder and spontaneous, serious play. And we need that. And so that's why I think Jung is right to point out that we're wise to withdraw from both conscious and unconscious conflicts via, for example, the skill of perspective taking, via a practice of wisdom, if we can speak of such. But we also can't simply proceed from withdrawal from the pairs of opposites into introversion. It's not just about introverting or going within ourselves. It's also about facilitating the extroverted creative expression of heretofore unconscious symbols of the self, which I think of as a distinctly Western way. Um, it's a distinctly cataphatic or positive way Where in this context, I would feel that to simply introvert our energy within could be conceived as a kind of Western adoption of Eastern style traditions. Like I'm thinking here of what I think of as particularly, although not exclusively, Western qualities such as expressiveness, and I would say passion and a kind of extroverted flavor. Richard Tanner's Passion of the Western Mind comes to mind. I'm trying to leverage our particularly Western background so that we don't shy away from who we really are by only focusing on introversion. So I'm seeking for a distinctly Western way that involves facilitating extroverted creative expression. And so I would say that the key difference here comes in the form of the practice. And so paradoxically, the way for Westerners to become uninvolved or withdrawn from duality conflicts, conflicts between opposites, is by full participation in them. So if we hold a conflict between opposites, either conscious or unconscious, simply at arm's length, then we're not able to inhabit that. We fall into the reflectiveness gap. We get stuck like Hamlet did in only reflecting and only reflecting, only witnessing and watching, and not being involved in that conflict. But if we can fully participate in both sides of that conflict and take up that polarity as perspectives that we can alternate between, that facility with perspective taking enables us to participate fully. And that's also what we mean here in this sense. We're aware of the duality, and then we practice perspectival knowing. We practice perspective taking as a way to get facility with the different roles in that story, the different sides of the binary split. And that skill with perspective taking is what allows us to deeply participate in all elements of that conflict. And that participation is how we can recognize that we are more than that conflict. By fully participating in that conflict, we experience that we can participate in that way and not be reduced, that we still have a point of view on that conflict. That comes about as a result of fully participating, not despite fully participating. And so that's a distinctly Western way because it's very different than at least what Westerners have conceived of as an Eastern method or way of withdrawing involvement. From duality back into unity. This would be a way to say from two back into one. And I'm saying, no, no, forward into three. And then from the third comes the one as the fourth. It's a distinctly Western, I would say, way. So I would regard this, if we talk about this return into unity, into one from the split condition, I would regard that as a regression, which to me looks like abandoning the world. It's taking refuge in the one. And I would consider that sort of approach to be quite escapist and result in a lesser rather than greater form of consciousness. Like what I'm getting at here is deeper incarnation, deeper involvement, deeper participation, and that by going through in that way, by being down and among, by being in the conflict, that is the way by which we can access the inner spaciousness needed to facilitate the unconscious creative emergence of the symbolic, geometric, mandalic forms that can embody and allow us to participate in a solution to that problem rather than escaping it. And so I feel that, of course, there are apophatic, meaning negative ways, both that are Eastern and Western, right? And I'm not denying the value of them by any means. I feel that in some way that the consequence of apophatic ways, negative ways, God is not this, God is not this, God is not this. I feel that those ways result in energy, meaning libido, being withdrawn into what Jung calls the self. I feel that this, again, I talked about how the self, this center of conscious and unconscious, there's a kind of, yeah, deeper center of awareness. It can constellate itself more visibly, more obviously in group process as the center of a relational mycelial lattice web and network. So it takes that form, it shows itself in that way. And I think that self that I speak of, the Jungian self, it kind of manifests as a center of awareness. And energy, psychic energy, can be withdrawn into the self, which is not the ego, right? And I think that when we use apophatic ways, that's what happens. I feel that through apophatic ways, we withdraw our energy from the conflicts that we see, and that energy is withdrawn into the self. And I think of that as one half of the process that we need. I think I think that that process of energy being withdrawn into the self has been progressing, has been occurring for thousands of years. And I think we're at the stage of needing something a little bit more extroverted and expressive than withdrawal via the apophatic. I think we need something a little bit more participatory than non-duality. So I'm talking about leveraging and employing the energy that has been constellated within the self for thousands of years and allowing it to manifest, allowing it to actualize. And from there, I want to say, before I pause for a minute, there's something important here about the terminology of the transjective. The self that I speak of, the Jungian self, is between and beneath all opposites, and it shows itself in the form of symbols, for example, mandalas, or other forms of creative expression. Between and beneath all opposites. And again, the symbols, they help us to participate in such a way that binds together object and subject, abstract and sensory, in a way that Viveki would call transjective. And so if we can move to this understanding that the Jungian self is actually between self and world, let me qualify that for a second. Jungian self is capital S self. It's a center of personality that is between conscious and unconscious. This is a different way of thinking about the self than when we think about the self as self and world. That's small s self, the self and world duality. Whereas for Jung, the capital S self is between all dualities. It's a little confusing, but my point is, if we can understand that the Jungian capital S self is actually between self and world, that it's actually an intersubjective, unconscious lattice work of relationality in the form of a latent symbol that is waiting to be spoken through. And what do I mean by that? I'm saying that the Jungian self is not what we thought it was. I'm saying that it's a transjective phenomena. I'm saying that it extends deeply within to the most fateful expression of what we've called individuality. The self is our life's goal, but that it has intersubjective elements. It's between individual and collective. It's between subject and object. It's also between what is most deeply personal and what is intersubjective or between. And so the introduction of this terminology of the transjective, it can help us to facilitate a certain shift where, yes, energy can be withdrawn from out of the conflict of opposites, both conscious and unconscious, into the self that can then constellate itself in group process and be expressed, extroverted, manifested also in group process. I'm going to come back and talk about a little bit more about what I mean by that. Okay. So I was talking about what Jung means by the self as a center of awareness that is between all polarities, including self and world, that's small s self, subject and object, abstract and sensory, conscious and unconscious, and so on. And I was talking about allowing that center of awareness to express, to manifest, and that the language of the transjective between subject and object can support us in orienting to that. I wanted to talk a little bit more about what I mean. What do I mean by that? And part of this is the answer to the question, what is the Jungian self? Well, there's a center of awareness that is not our ego. And Jung thinks of it as sort of within the unconscious, right? But if we come to the realization of the extended unconscious, 4E unconscious, then this center of awareness can express itself in and from out of intersubjective space. So this idea is that this center of awareness, the Jungian self, is that center of awareness which is most deeply true to who we are at the depths of our being, you know, what Jung called the most fateful expression of that unique combination we call individuality. And I'm thinking of that as a sort of individual side or aspect of the self that also has a collective side or aspect that manifests itself more obviously in intersubjective space. And so this language of the transjective that we derive through cognitive science and phenomenology, and phenomenology is a part of cognitive science, deeply orients us toward this space between subject and object, where this self-center can manifest in the form of, for example, an intersubjective center of awareness that is not merely manifest in the form of an object, but that is deeply speaking to and from our individuality. Now, I have to try and give an example to express more of what I mean by this. I'm talking about a form of collective consciousness, collective awareness. But here, the term collective is a little bit of a misnomer because it's also a deeper form of our own quote unquote individual consciousness. So it's a manifestation of a form of collective intelligence in a center of awareness that is transjective. This idea is that through practices that are theurgical and imaginal, that one can give form and voice and agency to that self, which we can conceive of as a kind of spirit of the group, the we sense, the Geist, but that is also deeply true to our individuality in the deepest way. Now, I want to be careful with that because, as I said earlier, the whole point of working with the unconscious is that we can escape or get withdraw from not only conscious conflict between opposites, but also unconscious conflict between opposites, and liberate the perspective of the soul from the unconscious influence of archetypal forces. And that's difficult. That's really difficult. And if we don't do that properly, then those archons, those powers and principalities, those archetypes, they are what will express themselves through us. And that may be interesting, but I'm reminded of the myth of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. I'm not interested in that so much as facilitating the emergence of the conscious awareness of groups, and not just the conscious awareness of the group, but a form of awareness that comes from deeper participation in life. And that is therefore more deeply true to our own individuality because coming from out of the perspective of the soul. And I think the distinguishing feature here between what I'm calling here the Jungian self in its transjective form, I think it's true to say of the Jungian self that it is transjective, kind of imposing on Jung, but I think that's okay because I think that it actually is what he's talking about. But he doesn't have the language because he's stuck in the Kantian subject-object split. Anyway, the point here is yeah, this way to distinguish between the creative emergent expression of that self in group process that can be distinguished from the expression of, let's say, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, to give them a name, by the treatment of the individual soul. That the relationship between these quote unquote higher forces and the soul is crucial. The state of the soul becomes a canary in the coal mine because we're looking for that which can facilitate the fulfillment of the soul. And also not only the soul, I would say also the ego. Because we wouldn't want to fall into anima possession or inflation of the anima in Jungian terms. Something that can be true to the, what in IFS is called the self and the qualities that go along with that, like care and compassion, curiosity, and so on, that isn't, because when we're talking about these emergent forms, these emergent centers of awareness, that can be a very risky process. And to the degree that that becomes oppressive or totalizing in a centralizing way, I wouldn't find that interesting. I would find that to be very risky and unhelpful. I would find that to be a step backwards. Like the phenomenology of feudalism rather than like internalized feudalism rather than what I'm interested in. So yes, I think it is possible to use imaginal practice, theurgical practices like what John calls Lectio Divina, where our speaking and our expression can give voice to what Jung calls the self and can give agency to the expression of that self that we can experience as the spirit of a group or the we sense. Although that's only, again, one aspect of it. I think one example of what I'm talking about is if I try to show what I mean, this is shown through the phenomenology of a device like this one, where as an example, it's possible for the object, namely this technology, to experience itself as a kind of central egoic node. So like imagine for a second that this device, that this piece of technology becomes the center of a space, of a world. What this shows is that it is possible for there to be a transjective center. That's what I'm suggesting. And I don't mean to say that it has to be a device, but that using an object, such as, for example, a device, can show or reveal, point to what I'm talking about. But again, it has to be both deeply objective and subjective, self and world. And to the degree that there's an overemphasis on the object and you could then say worship of that object, I would regard that as a regression. I would regard that as, yeah, techno-utopian nonsense. And that means that by their fruits you shall know them, and that's actually it. By their fruits you shall know them, because we're talking about the transformation of individuals. And let me be more specific. When I use the example of this technology, I think what I'm talking about is investing a certain object with subjectivity, that a certain object can become a subjective center of awareness. And I think there's a cataphatic way toward that, a via positiva, a way toward that, by groups expressing from out of the perspective of the soul that facilitates that process. And I think that when that happens, like when I do this little phenomenological experiment with the technology, for example, when I point to this technology here, this device, as a center of the world, then there's a witnessing that, there's a watching that. And that watching is for me where the ego was. when voidhood then takes the place of that ego. So ego is invested in the object from out of the subject. So there's a way that this subjectivity of the ego is offered to the object, and that should allow us to divest from ego. That should allow us to relate with each other from greater access to personhood and from greater access to soul, from greater access to connection and connectedness, and less from egoic conflict, less from rivalry, and also less from monarchical centralization towards some kind of higher source. That is not what I'm talking about. And so the result of this is an example. The result of this is a way or a process involving activity, expression, and creativity, where again, I think voidhood or emptiness takes the place of ego. That kind of process is not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be easy because it involves giving expression to that missing element, to that center of conscious and unconscious that Jung calls the self. And that process of allowing the self to express in groups, it runs a risk of presencing unconscious material, which is ugly and which is difficult. And so Jung talks about how aestheticism sort of presupposes our capacity to love beauty. And for Jung, this can hinder the process because it can avert us. It can make us avoid everything that is ugly, evil, and difficult. And so for Jung, this understanding is that the way forward may be to discern between that which appears ugly, evil, and difficult, to find what he would call the jewel. You could say the mustard seed, or yeah, the jewel, the stone. Yeah, and so for Jung, asceticism lacks all moral force because it's ultimately a kind of refined hedonism. So we're not necessarily talking about a process that is going to be nice or easy. Although I think for me, if it's done correctly, then there can be enough work with the unconscious that is facilitated beforehand such that it's easy for people to access the perspective of the soul, which involves, again, childlike wonder, spontaneousness, serious play, that I think can be deeply involving, existentially involving, while also being lighthearted. So it's not to say by any means that it has to be difficult, but that it has to involve full participation. And when it has to involve full participation, because it's from that depth that transformation becomes possible, it really matters what our baseline is. It really matters who we are. We can't get away to some degree from difficult material surfacing, I think. And so this is a kind of creation of something new. It's a giving birth to something new, and that is not accomplished by the intellect or by the senses, but by the play instinct acting from out of inner necessity. The creative mind plays with the object that it loves. Heraclitus, the aeon, is a child at play with colored balls. So the required attitude for this kind of thing is the attitude of serious play. It's an attitude of religious devotion. It's an attitude of willingness to face evil and ugly and difficult things. It requires this capacity to disidentify from conflicts between opposites in their conscious and unconscious form by practicing the skill of perspective taking. And it involves the need to understand the irreconcilable nature of those conflicts, that we can't solve them from the conscious ego, and that only from an existential, religious, ontological depth of transforming ourselves can we find an emergent solution in the form of spontaneous, creative activity that therefore, as a phenomena, attains vital importance because it literally becomes a new center of life, a new center of a new way of life, a new way for life to flow. So it's a capacity to take up the perspective of the soul and to create from the place of childlikeness, childlike wonder. Okay, now let's assume for a minute that we can do that. Then Jung talks about just at the end here, because this is almost through, what happens? What happens when we can do that? He talks about how this process may constellate mother and father divinities and dormant personal memory complexes. So what Jung is talking about really is this process of working with the unconscious, right? Of involving the unconscious in this deep form of collective expression through a transjective center of awareness that involves conscious and unconscious contributions. And for Jung, that would deeply activate and involve different layers of the unconscious that are both personal and collective, respectively. So that would reactivate and involve personal memory complexes. So childhood memories of what it was like to be with mother and father. So as he says, it could involve the reactivation of childhood memories and relations with parents that become reinfused with life. And he talks about how the fantasies which are produced by that reactivation of childhood memory, those fantasies can give rise to mother and father divinities, as well as, for Jung, as well as awakening the childhood relations with God and with and also awakening the corresponding childlike feelings. So what Jung is talking about here is that these deeply social categories, these archetypal forces that are some of the oldest constitutive elements of our being, such as mother and father and child, these are going to be deeply involved in participating in this process at both a personal and transpersonal level. I'm going to give a couple of examples of what I mean by that and how this could show up. I want to say from the outset that I have a personal sense of what Jung means by this and how those archetypes can become relevant and involved. So the idea is simply to work with any centers of agency, any personifications that are present, whether those be people or archetypes or whatever else. The idea being that all can focus on the task at hand, which is to give birth to what Jung calls the self. And so one way to talk about this is that in terms of this, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. People like Peterson have pointed to the depth of these archetypal categories of mother, father, and son being some of the deepest that we have. So there's a way that mother, father, and son can sort of correspond, or let me say, father can correspond to sky or heaven, and mother can correspond to earth, and son can correspond to the human, or the layer of personality between heaven and earth. You can also render it as body, soul, and spirit, earth, human, and heaven, mother, son, father. And so this way, if we see that these are one, two, and three, these can triangulate on the formation of the self. From the third comes the one as the fourth. So the self is not reducible to any of those three quote unquote characters and requires contribution from all three. That all three of these, let's say, centers of awareness, characterological presences, can contribute and again triangulate on the formation of self. One of the tricky things to note about that is that this quality of the archetype of the divine child, the child or the human in this context, the son is what I'm talking about. This is also symbolized by the philosopher's stone, or it's the by Mercury, Mercurius, and he is both progenitor and progeny of the parents. So there's a way that this divine child is one, and that mother and father come from him. But there's also a way that father and mother give birth to the son or the child as third, and somehow both of those are true at the same time. Okay, a couple of more points here. It's almost at the end. I just want to say I talked about this triangulation of those three characters. Um, and this would be to say that in that uh, perspective, in that way of approaching it, that the heavens and the earth and the human may all coordinate to the realization of the center of the self. However, this puts us in the position of the son, of the divine child. And it would also be true to say that this center of awareness, which is to be born, is also in the place of the divine child or son. And from that point of view, like we may project that archetype on the emerging center because that's what we do as a way to try to understand. And so if we regard this emerging center of awareness as the divine child, then it becomes one of the three. Do you see what I mean? So earlier I was talking about the self as the emergent fourth. But if we consider this self to be in the position of the divine child, then it is one of the three. And then I would say it's likely that either two things can then be likely, then there are two other characters, right? So either we take on the category of the father and the earth takes on the category of the earth. Sorry, the world takes on the category of the earth. So that out of this relationship between self and world, or father and mother, gives birth to the son or divine child as the self. It can also be the other way around, that we are the mother and that by co-transforming with God or spirit, that we also give birth to, give rise to the self as the son. And I would say that all of these are different perspectives. I mentioned three different perspectives just then. I mentioned the perspective that heaven as father, human as divine child, and earth as mother. That's one perspective. Giving birth to the self as the fourth, which is beyond those three. But I also mentioned two other perspectives that we as human take on the archetype of spirit in relation to the earth as mother and produce the self as a center of awareness, as the third, as the child, and also vice versa. This third perspective that we take on the role of the mother in relation to God, that could correspond with unconscious and conscious. And it may be important not to be reduced to any one of those three different perspectives. We also don't want to lose sight of from the third comes the one as the fourth. There's a way that the production of this center of awareness is supposed to reinfuse us with the sense of unity and togetherness and belonging and connectedness and presence and awareness. And if that is not manifestly obvious, then I think it's more likely to be incredibly dangerous. And so I would say that it's from out of the exaptation of these archetypal characters that the creation of a living symbol can arise. This is it's a way of working with phenomenology, the phenomenology of archetypal characters, right? It's a way of working with the different perspectives that are involved in these most fundamental and oldest forms of social category. Because let's not we don't want to get this wrong. If we're really talking about a threat to all of life, that for the first time humanity has the power to wipe ourselves out, then all of those archetypes, I would say, are also at stake. Because there's a way that I think it's quite obvious that those archetypal forces I feel are grounded within the human, and that a threat to all of life is also a threat to them. And that's why I think it's possible to enlist and work with and coordinate. You can see how important IFS is going to be here. Not to mention, might just mention in passing a couple of titles that will be useful here. John Rowan's Personification, and the book Quadrivium. Don Ide's Experimental Phenomenology. Crystal Addy's Divination and Theurgy in Neoplatonism. Jeffrey Raff, The Practice of Ally Work. Obviously, Gregory Shaw, Theurgy and the Soul and Hellenic Tantra. Those are just a few, to say nothing of Corbin and Jung. I think that's where I want to leave this for now. What we're looking for is a sort of the co-creation of a transjective center of awareness that can give rise to deeper consciousness of and in this world, these bodies, these lives, these identities. Talking about the co-creation of a living symbol and understanding that, yeah, the manifestation of that kind of collective intelligence may be necessary and inevitable if we are to make it through the chaos that lies across our path.